My name is Hazel, and at 31 years old, I never imagined my own mother would ban me from my younger brother's wedding. The reason I refused to pretend my miscarriage never happened because it might upset the guests. So while my family celebrated in Martha's Vineyard, I was sipping cocktails in Santorini. What I didn't expect was my cousins secretly live-streaming the reception disaster to me. Before I tell you how my absence caused the complete unraveling of my family's carefully constructed lies, where are you watching from? Hit subscribe, because this story proves sometimes the best revenge is a plane ticket. Growing up in suburban Boston, I thought our family was normal, maybe a little more successful than most, but nothing that screamed dysfunction. My mother Eleanor built her real estate empire from scratch, turning a small inheritance into a multi-million-dollar business. She wore her success like armor, using it to control every aspect of our lives. My father James was a renowned cardiac surgeon at Mass General, but at home he might as well have been invisible. He buried himself in medical journals and surgery schedules, emerging only for the mandatory family photos Eleanor orchestrated. My younger brother Adam was the golden child from day one. 3 years younger than me, he sailed through Harvard Law, never disappointing our mother once. While I struggled through my pregnancies and losses, Adam was collecting accolades and making law review. He had this way of smiling that made you forget he never actually stood up for anyone. He just nodded along to whatever Eleanor said, keeping his perfect record intact. When Adam announced his engagement to Victoria Worthington last spring, Eleanor acted like she'd won the lottery. Victoria came from old Boston money, the kind where streets were named after your ancestors. Her family owned half of Beacon Hill and had a compound in Martha's Vineyard that had been featured in Architectural Digest twice. For Eleanor, this wasn't just a marriage, it was a merger that would cement our family's place in Boston society forever. The engagement party at the country club was orchestrated like a military operation. Eleanor hired 3 event planners and a publicity consultant. She actually had us rehearse our entrances and practice our smiles. I remember standing in the bathroom looking at my reflection and wondering when my family had become a performance. That was 2 weeks after my 3rd miscarriage, the one that finally broke my marriage to Marcus. Marcus and I had been trying for 4 years. 3 pregnancies, 3 losses, each one taking a piece of our relationship with it. After the 3rd miscarriage in March, he sat me down in our kitchen and said he couldn't do it anymore. He said watching me grieve was killing him, that he needed to move on with his life. He moved out the next week, leaving me alone in our Brookline apartment with an empty nursery I couldn't bring myself to dismantle. When I told Eleanor about the divorce, her first response wasn't concern or comfort. She said, and I quote, "Stop being dramatic. People have real problems." She was worried about how it would look at Adam's wedding having a divorced daughter. The miscarriages were never mentioned. In her world, they were my failure, something to be hidden and never discussed. The wedding planning started immediately after the engagement party. Eleanor took complete control, treating it like her personal project. She hired the most expensive wedding planner in Boston, booked the Worthington family's country club for the reception, and started micromanaging every detail. Victoria seemed overwhelmed, but went along with it, probably thinking this was just how involved mothers were. My assigned role was clear from the start. I was to be the supportive older sister who would give a glowing speech about Adam and welcome Victoria to our perfect family. Eleanor even started writing my speech for me, filled with lies about our wonderful childhood and close sibling bond. She wanted me to tell stories that never happened, paint a picture of a family that never existed. The first red flag came during the dress fitting in May. Eleanor had chosen matching dresses for all the bridesmaids, including me. When the seamstress asked about alterations, Eleanor looked at me critically and said I needed to lose at least 15 pounds. She said my post-miscarriage weight gain was unacceptable, that I would ruin the photos. Her exact words were, "You need to look presentable, this wedding will be in Town and Country magazine." Adam was there for that fitting, getting his tux adjusted in the next room. He heard every cruel word but said nothing. When I looked at him for support, he suddenly became very interested in his phone. This was the pattern of our entire lives. Eleanor would cut me down, and Adam would disappear into himself, avoiding any conflict that might tarnish his golden boy status. But the worst part came when Eleanor pulled me aside privately. She said she'd been thinking about the Marcus situation. Since the divorce wasn't final yet, she wanted me to pretend we were still together. She actually wanted me to wear my wedding ring and tell anyone who asked that Marcus was away on business. She said it would be easier than explaining the truth and dealing with people's pity. I started seeing Dr. Martinez, a therapist who specialized in family trauma, that same week. She helped me understand that what I was experiencing wasn't normal family stress. It was systematic emotional abuse disguised as concern for appearances. She taught me about boundaries and self-worth concepts that felt foreign after 31 years of Eleanor's conditioning. It was Dr. Martinez who gave me the strength to finally say no. The confrontation happened at a family dinner in early June, 6 weeks before the wedding. Eleanor had called a mandatory meeting to go over the wedding timeline. She'd printed actual agendas and placed them at each seat like we were her board of directors. The dining room table was covered with seating charts, vendor contracts, and color-coded schedules. She started by discussing the rehearsal dinner, then moved on to the ceremony logistics. Everything was planned to the minute. Then she got to what she called the family presentation standards. She looked directly at me and said we needed to discuss my situation. She explained that she'd already told the Worthingtons I was happily married to a successful investment banker. She'd even shown them old photos from my wedding to prove what a perfect couple Marcus and I were. When I asked what would happen when Marcus obviously wasn't at the wedding, she had an answer ready. She would tell people he was closing a major deal in Tokyo and couldn't get away. If pressed, she had a whole backstory prepared about international markets and time-sensitive negotiations. She'd thought of everything except the possibility that I might not go along with it. I set down my fork and told her I wouldn't lie. I said I was divorced or soon to be, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. I told her about the pain of the miscarriages, how Marcus leaving had shattered me, and how I was finally starting to heal. I said I wouldn't undo that progress by living a lie for her comfort. Eleanor's face turned red, then purple. She slammed her hand on the table, making the wine glasses jump. She called me selfish and attention-seeking. She said I always had to make everything about myself, that I couldn't even let Adam have his special day without creating drama. She said I was determined to embarrass the family and ruin everything she'd worked for. James sat there through all of this, scrolling through his phone like he was in a waiting room instead of a family explosion. This was his signature move, complete disengagement when Eleanor went on the attack. He'd perfected the art of being physically present but emotionally absent, a skill he'd probably developed for his own survival. Adam finally spoke up, but not to defend me. He said, "Can't you just do this for me, just this once?" He had this pleading look in his eyes like a child begging for a treat. He said it was just one day, a few hours really, and then everything could go back to normal. He didn't understand that normal was exactly what I was trying to escape. Eleanor revealed she'd gone even further with her lies. She'd told Victoria's mother that Marcus and I were trying for children, painting us as the perfect happy couple. She'd created an entire fictional life for me, one where I was fulfilled and successful and normal. The real me, the grieving, divorced, childless me, was too embarrassing to acknowledge. Then she dropped the biggest shock. She'd actually looked into hiring an actor to play Marcus at the wedding. She had his headshot on her phone, a handsome man who looked vaguely like my ex-husband if you squinted. She said he was a professional, that he'd done this kind of thing before for important families. She said it like it was perfectly reasonable, like hiring a fake husband was just another wedding expense. I stood up to leave, my whole body shaking with rage and hurt. Eleanor gave me an ultimatum right there. Either I agreed to her terms, all of them, or I wasn't welcome at the wedding. She said it clearly, without any emotion, like she was firing an employee. Adam said nothing. James kept scrolling. The silence was deafening. The next morning I woke up to a formal email from Eleanor. It was written like a business memo, complete with bullet points and action items. I was officially disinvited from the wedding. The email was copied to the entire extended family with a note saying I had a scheduling conflict and wouldn't be able to attend. She'd already created the lie to cover my absence. My phone started ringing immediately. The first call was from my Aunt Linda, Eleanor's former sister-in-law. She knew something was wrong because Eleanor never communicated family news directly. There was always a layer of assistance and careful messaging. Linda had been through her own exclusion from the family years ago when she divorced Eleanor's brother after catching him cheating. Eleanor had sided with her brother naturally, and Linda had been erased from family events ever since. Linda told me about the pattern I'd been too close to see. Eleanor had been systematically removing imperfect family members for decades. Anyone who didn't fit her image of success and propriety was gradually or suddenly pushed out. There was Cousin Jeffrey, who was excluded after coming out. Aunt Ruth, who was labeled difficult after seeking treatment for depression. Uncle George, who was phased out after his business failed. The family tree was littered with broken branches, all pruned by Eleanor's merciless shears. That afternoon, I booked a solo trip to Santorini. 2 weeks at a boutique hotel overlooking the caldera, far away from Boston and its suffocating expectations. As I entered my credit card information, I felt a mix of liberation and profound sadness. I was choosing myself, but it meant losing the only family I'd ever known. The price of authenticity, it turned out, was everything I'd been taught to value. The week before the wedding, I packed for Greece, while Eleanor spread her version of events throughout Boston society. According to her, I was having emergency surgery for a gynecological issue, something vague but serious enough to require immediate attention. She played it perfectly, accepting sympathy with grace, while implying I was too private to want visitors or calls. My cousin Melissa, who was still invited to the wedding, became my secret informant. She called me every night with updates, whispering from her bedroom like a spy, reporting from enemy territory. She told me how Eleanor's lies were getting more elaborate, how the story changed depending on who was asking. To some, I had surgery. To others, I was at a spiritual retreat. To Victoria's family, I was dealing with a work emergency in London. The problem started when I posted a photo from Santorini on Instagram. It was just a sunset pink and gold over the white buildings and blue domes. I'd captioned it, "Finding Peace." Within an hour, Victoria's sister Sophie had seen it and sent it to Victoria with a question mark. If I was having emergency surgery, how was I watching sunsets in Greece? Eleanor went into damage control mode. She forced Adam to call me something he hadn't done since the dinner confrontation. He sounded exhausted and desperate. He begged me to take down all social media to go dark until after the wedding. He said Eleanor was threatening to call off the whole thing if I didn't cooperate. I told him that wasn't my problem and hung up. Then I posted another photo, this one of my breakfast overlooking the Aegean. Melissa reported that the rehearsal dinner was tense. Victoria's mother kept asking about me, saying how strange it was that the groom's only sibling wasn't there. Eleanor stuck to her surgery story, but people were starting to notice the inconsistencies. Why hadn't anyone visited me in the hospital? Why weren't there any get-well cards being collected? Why did Adam look like he might throw up every time my name was mentioned? My Uncle Peter, Eleanor's older brother, reached out privately. He'd always been the black sheep of their family, too honest for Eleanor's taste. He texted me asking for the truth, promising he wouldn't share it with Eleanor. When I told him everything, he wasn't surprised. He said Eleanor had been like this since childhood, always creating the narrative she wanted rather than accepting reality. Peter shared his own stories of Eleanor's cruelty, how she'd sabotaged his first marriage by constantly telling his wife she could do better, how she'd spread rumors about his business to make herself look more successful by comparison, how she'd rewritten their entire family history to make herself the hero of every story. He'd learned to keep his distance, showing up for major events, but never getting too close. The wedding planner, a poor woman named Jennifer, was caught in the middle of all this chaos. She kept getting different instructions about the seating chart, the programs, the speeches. One day I was included, the next I wasn't. One version had me as maid of honor, another had me not existing at all. Melissa heard her on the phone with her assistant saying this was the strangest wedding she'd ever coordinated. Victoria started noticing things too. She was a smart woman, Harvard-educated like Adam, and the pieces weren't adding up. She texted me directly one evening, a simple message asking if I was okay. I thought carefully about my response. I didn't want to sabotage my brother's marriage, but I also wouldn't lie for Eleanor anymore. I wrote back that I was fine, that there were family differences about my attendance, and that I wished her and Adam happiness. Victoria's response surprised me. She said she'd been feeling uneasy about Eleanor's involvement, that something felt off about the whole family dynamic. She asked if we could talk when I got back from Greece. I agreed, though I doubted Eleanor would allow that conversation to happen. Meanwhile, Eleanor was doubling down on her lies. Melissa overheard her telling the bridesmaids that I was mentally unstable, that my miscarriages had broken something in my mind. She painted me as a tragic figure who couldn't be trusted around normal people. She said the family was protecting me by keeping me away, that it was for my own good. The bridesmaids, several of whom knew me from college, weren't buying it. They'd seen my Instagram posts clearly showing a woman enjoying Greece, not someone in mental distress. They started asking Adam questions he couldn't answer. Why hadn't he visited his supposedly ill sister? Why did his mother's story keep changing? Why did he look terrified every time someone mentioned my name? My best friend Carol, who'd known me since we were 5, was still invited to the wedding. She'd been my maid of honor, and Eleanor couldn't uninvite her without raising even more questions. Carol appointed herself as my representative, determined to document everything for me. She promised to be my eyes and ears to witness whatever disaster Eleanor had created. Carol confronted Adam 2 nights before the wedding. She found him at the hotel bar drinking alone and looking miserable. She asked him point-blank why he'd abandoned me for his mother. His response was pathetic but predictable. He said he just wanted one day without conflict, one perfect day where everyone was happy. He said I could have pretended for a few hours that it wasn't too much to ask. Carol told him he was a coward and walked away. The morning of the wedding, I woke up in Santorini to dozens of messages. The wedding party group chat, which I hadn't been removed from due to an oversight, was in chaos. 3 bridesmaids were threatening to drop out. Victoria's family was asking questions Eleanor couldn't answer, and Adam had been up all night throwing up from anxiety. The perfect wedding was already crumbling, and the ceremony hadn't even started. The morning of the wedding, I sat on my hotel balcony in Santorini, watching the sun paint the white buildings gold. My phone buzzed constantly with updates from multiple sources. Carol, Melissa, Peter, and even some of Victoria's friends were sending me real-time reports. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash from 3,000 miles away. The ceremony itself went smoothly enough. Eleanor had hired the best of everything, and professionals know how to maintain appearances. The church looked beautiful, the flowers were perfect, and the string quartet played flawlessly. But Melissa said there was a tension in the air, like everyone was holding their breath. The absence of the groom's only sibling was a presence in itself, an empty space that drew attention. Victoria's grandmother, a sharp woman in her 80s, apparently asked loudly during the processional where Adam's sister was. Eleanor, sitting in the front row, whispered something about emergency surgery. But Victoria's grandmother, who was slightly deaf, asked even louder why no one had mentioned this before. The whispers spread through the church like wildfire. By the time Victoria walked down the aisle, half the guests were murmuring about my mysterious absence. The reception started at the Worthington family's country club, a sprawling estate overlooking the Atlantic. Eleanor had spent a fortune transforming it into what looked like a royal wedding venue. Crystal chandeliers imported orchids, a 20-piece band. Everything was designed to impress, to make a statement about our family's place in society. Carol positioned herself strategically at a table near the main reception area. She had her phone ready, promising to live stream anything significant. She said Adam looked green during the cocktail hour, barely able to hold conversations. Victoria seemed tense too, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. The careful facade was already cracking. The disaster began during Eleanor's mother of the groom speech. She stood up, champagne glass in hand, diamonds glittering in the light. She started talking about family, about legacy, about the joining of 2 perfect bloodlines. She used the word perfect 6 times in the first minute. She talked about raising successful children, about the importance of maintaining standards, about how proud she was of her unblemished family. That's when Uncle Peter stood up. He was drunk, Melissa said, but not sloppy drunk. He was truth-telling drunk, the kind where decades of resentment finally find their voice. He clinked his glass loudly, interrupting Eleanor mid-sentence. He said he wanted to make a toast, too, to the family members who couldn't be there. Eleanor's face went white. Peter started listing names. He said, here's to Jeffrey, who was banned for loving who he loved. Here's to Ruth, who was exiled for having the audacity to seek help for depression. Here's to Linda, who was erased for not forgiving a cheater. And here's to Hazel, who's watching the sunset in Santorini because she refused to pretend her babies never existed. The room went absolutely silent. You could hear the ocean through the open windows. Then Peter dropped the biggest bomb. He pointed to a man at table 12 and said, "And here's to Marcus, or at least the actor being paid to pretend to be Marcus. Yes, folks, my sister hired an actor to play her daughter's ex-husband because reality doesn't match her requirements. The man at table 12, looking mortified, actually stood up and confirmed it. He said he was supposed to be paid $500 to pretend to be Marcus, but he hadn't received the money yet. He said he was told it was for a prank, but this clearly wasn't funny. He grabbed his jacket and left, walking right past the head table where Eleanor sat frozen. Victoria stood up slowly, her face a mask of controlled fury. She looked at Adam and asked very clearly if this was true. Adam, my brother who'd never stood up to anyone in his life, crumbled completely. He admitted everything. The ban, the lies about my surgery, the attempt to hire an actor. He said it all in a rush, like poison leaving his system. Victoria's next move was spectacular. She took off her veil, folded it carefully, and placed it on the table. She looked at Eleanor and said she'd wondered what kind of mother would exclude her own daughter from a wedding. Now she knew. She said she came from a family where people supported each other through miscarriages, divorces, and struggles, where pain was met with compassion, not punishment. Then she turned to Adam and delivered the killing blow. She said she couldn't trust someone who would abandon his sister for the sake of appearances. She said if he could do that to me, what would he do to their future children if they didn't meet Eleanor's standards? Would they be erased too? Eleanor tried to salvage the situation. She stood up, trying to use her commanding presence to regain control. She said this was all a misunderstanding, that I had chosen not to attend, that I was unstable and needed help. But people had seen my Instagram posts. They knew I was in Greece, clearly fine, clearly excluded, rather than absent by choice. The Worthington family walked out as a unit. Victoria's father stopped at the microphone on his way out and apologized to the remaining guests for the disruption. He said his family had been deceived about the character of the people they were joining with, and they needed to reassess. The social assassination was complete and public. Eleanor started screaming that I had ruined everything from 3,000 miles away. She actually said those exact words loud enough for everyone to hear. She blamed me for Peter's speech, for the actor leaving, for Victoria's reaction. In her mind, this was all my fault for not playing along with her fiction. Melissa was live streaming by this point, and I watched my mother's complete breakdown in real time. She was ranting about ingratitude, about sacrifice, about how she'd given us everything. Adam sat at the head table with his head in his hands while his marriage ended after less than 4 hours. The band had stopped playing. The guests were either leaving or filming on their phones. The wedding that was supposed to cement our family's social position instead destroyed it completely. Within hours, the videos were spreading through Boston society. The headlines on social media were brutal. Wedding meltdown, mother from hell, fake husband hired for family image. Eleanor's carefully constructed reputation was destroyed in the time it took to serve the salad course. Carol sent me a final video of the empty reception hall. Hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of decorations, food, and flowers abandoned like a crime scene. The ice sculptures were melting. The wedding cake stood uncut. The dance floor that had been meant for celebration became the stage for our family's public destruction. My phone started ringing nonstop as the reception ended. Victoria called first from what sounded like her car. She was driving away from the venue, still in her wedding dress, mascara streaking down her face. She apologized for not seeing the red flags sooner. She said there had been signs, moments where Eleanor's mask slipped, but she'd dismissed them as wedding stress. She told me about the conversations she'd witnessed, the way Eleanor talked about me when she thought no one was listening. The words defective and embarrassment were used frequently. Victoria said she'd wanted to meet me properly, to know Adam's only sibling, but Eleanor always had excuses for why that couldn't happen. Now she understood why. I was evidence that the perfect family wasn't perfect at all. Adam texted me frantically over the next hour. His messages went from angry to desperate to pathetic. First he blamed me for ruining his wedding, then he begged me to call Victoria and fix things. Finally he admitted he'd lost everything because he was too weak to stand up to our mother. I didn't respond to any of them. He'd made his choice at that family dinner, and now he was living with the consequences. Eleanor left me a voicemail that I'll never forget. Her voice was raw with rage. She said I was a disappointment from the day I was born, that I'd never been good enough, pretty enough, successful enough, that my inability to have children was probably nature's way of preventing me from spreading my weakness. She said I was no longer her daughter, that she was writing me out of her will and her life. It was the most honest she'd ever been with me. James finally called around midnight Boston time. It was the first time we'd had a real conversation in years. His voice sounded different, like he'd aged a decade in one day. He admitted he knew Eleanor was wrong, had always known. But he'd been a coward, choosing the path of least resistance to preserve his comfortable life. He said watching the wedding implode had finally woken him up to what he'd allowed to happen to our family. He revealed something that shocked me. Their marriage had been dead for 15 years. They slept in separate bedrooms, lived essentially separate lives, only coming together for public appearances. He'd wanted to leave after I graduated college, but Eleanor threatened to destroy his medical career with rumors and lies. So he'd stayed burying himself in work, pretending not to see her cruelty toward me and others. The family group chat exploded with messages from relatives who'd been at the wedding. Each one had their own perspective on the disaster, their own moment of realization about Eleanor's true nature. Cousin Jennifer said she'd always wondered why family gatherings felt so tense. Uncle Robert admitted he'd noticed how certain family members disappeared from photos and stories. Aunt Patricia said she'd been afraid to speak up, worried about becoming Eleanor's next target. Within hours, we had a new group chat. Linda named it the Family Rejects, and it quickly filled with people sharing their stories. Jeffrey wrote from San Francisco about the Christmas he'd been uninvited after bringing his boyfriend home. Ruth shared how Eleanor had told everyone her depression was attention-seeking behavior. George talked about how his business failure had led to his gradual exclusion from family events. We discovered Eleanor had been systematically controlling and excluding family members for over 20 years. Anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of success and propriety was pushed out. Divorce, mental health struggles, financial problems, sexuality, even just disagreeing with her could lead to banishment. The perfect family she presented to the world was actually a carefully curated group of those who either met her standards or were too afraid to challenge them. The actor Eleanor had hired to play Marcus actually called me to apologize. His name was Trevor, and he was a struggling actor who thought this was just another weird gig. He'd done similar jobs before, playing boyfriends or husbands for people who needed dates to events, but he'd never been asked to participate in something this elaborate or deceptive. He said Eleanor had coached him for hours on Marcus's supposed job, our relationship history, even what to say if someone asked about children. He offered to testify if I wanted to take legal action. The next morning, Boston society was buzzing with the scandal. The country club gossip network, which Eleanor had always used to her advantage, turned against her viciously. The story grew with each telling. By noon, Eleanor had apparently hired multiple actors. By evening, she'd been running a fraud ring. The truth was bad enough, but the embellishments made it even worse. Several of Eleanor's charity boards called emergency meetings. A woman who would ban her own daughter and hire actors to maintain appearances wasn't someone they wanted representing their organizations. Her real estate business started getting cancellation calls from clients who didn't want to be associated with the scandal. The empire she'd built on image and reputation was crumbling as fast as news could travel. Victoria's family publicly distanced themselves from ours. Mrs. Worthington gave an interview to a society blogger saying they'd been deceived about the character and values of the family their daughter was marrying into. She said they supported Victoria's decision to seek an annulment and would ensure she was protected legally and financially. The subtext was clear, that the Worthingtons would use their considerable influence to destroy what was left of Eleanor's reputation. Adam showed up at my apartment when I returned from Greece 3 days later. He looked like he hadn't slept since the wedding. His eyes were red, his usually perfect hair was a mess, and he'd lost weight even in that short time. Victoria had moved back to her parents' house and hired a lawyer. Their marriage had lasted exactly 1 week, though it had really ended the moment Peter started his toast. He stood in my doorway, this golden boy who'd never faced a consequence in his life, and asked me what he should do. The irony wasn't lost on me. The sister he'd abandoned was now his only hope for salvaging his life. But I didn't have any magic solutions for him. He'd chosen Eleanor's approval over everything else, and now he was paying the price. Adam looked so broken standing in my doorway that for a moment I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered him sitting silent at that family dinner, choosing our mother's lies over my truth. I let him in anyway, more out of curiosity than compassion. He sat on my couch, the same one where I'd sobbed after each miscarriage, and started talking. He told me Victoria was considering an annulment, that her lawyer had already contacted him. She couldn't trust someone who would sacrifice his own sister for appearances. She kept asking him what else he might hide or lie about. What would happen if they had a child with special needs? Would Eleanor make that child disappear too? Would Adam let her? The worst part, he said, was that Victoria was right. He admitted he'd been letting Eleanor control him his entire life. Every decision, from his college major to his law firm choice to his proposal timeline, had been orchestrated by our mother. He'd never actually chosen anything for himself. He was 31 years old and had no idea who he really was outside of Eleanor's expectations. Then he revealed something that shouldn't have surprised me, but did. Eleanor had been threatening him with disinheritance for years. Every time he even slightly disagreed with her, she'd remind him that all the family money came from her father's business, that she controlled everything. She'd rewritten her will dozens of times, adding and removing people based on their obedience level. He showed me a text from her saying his trust fund was already being restructured. I asked him why he was telling me this now when it was too late to matter. He said Dr. Martinez's name, which shocked me. Apparently, Adam had been secretly seeing my therapist's colleague for months, dealing with anxiety and panic attacks he'd hidden from everyone. The perfect son was taking medication just to get through family dinners. The wedding disaster had been his breaking point. I told him about my conditions for helping him. He had to tell Victoria everything, every manipulation, every threat, every moment of cowardice. And he had to commit to real therapy, not just crisis management. He needed to understand why he'd chosen our mother over everyone else and make sure he never did it again. He agreed immediately, desperation overriding pride. That evening, Eleanor summoned me to her house. The text was formal, like a legal document. She required my presence to discuss the family situation. I brought Carol and Linda with me as support and witnesses. I wasn't walking into Eleanor's territory alone and defenseless. The house looked exactly the same as always, pristine and cold like a museum. Eleanor was in the living room, sitting in her favorite chair like a queen on her throne. She'd clearly spent hours on her appearance, full makeup and designer dress, trying to project power she no longer had. But I could see the cracks. Her hands shook slightly. Her voice wasn't quite steady. She started with gaslighting her favorite tool. She said this was all a misunderstanding that had been blown out of proportion. She claimed she'd never actually banned me from the wedding that I'd chosen to leave. She said the actor was just a precaution in case I changed my mind about attending. Every lie was delivered with complete conviction, as if saying it enough would make it true. I came prepared. I pulled out my phone and showed her the emails, the texts, the voicemail she'd left calling me defective. I had screenshots of every cruel message, recordings of her threats, documentation of years of emotional manipulation. Linda had brought her own evidence from when Eleanor had systematically destroyed her marriage to Eleanor's brother. Carol had statements from other family members who'd witnessed Eleanor's behavior over the years. Eleanor's mask finally slipped completely. She started screaming that we were all ungrateful parasites who'd contributed nothing while living off her success. She said she'd created this family's wealth and status from nothing, that we owed her everything. She admitted she'd only had children because successful people were supposed to have families. We were accessories to her image, nothing more. James appeared in the doorway, surprising everyone. He rarely came home anymore, basically living at the hospital to avoid Eleanor. But he'd heard about this confrontation and decided it was time to finally show up. He looked at Eleanor with something I'd never seen before in his eyes. Disgust mixed with pity. He announced he was filing for separation. The words hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. Eleanor turned on him, calling him weak and pathetic, saying he'd be nothing without her connections and money. James just smiled sadly and said he'd rather be nothing than continue being her prop. He'd already seen a lawyer and moved his things to an apartment near the hospital. That's when the doorbell rang. It was Adam and Victoria together, but clearly not reconciled. Victoria said she wanted to hear from Eleanor directly why I'd been banned from the wedding. She wanted to understand what kind of family she'd almost joined. Eleanor tried to return to her gaslighting, but Victoria wasn't having it. Victoria had done her research. She'd talked to former employees of Eleanor's company who'd been fired for minor infractions. She'd found 3 different event planners who'd refused to work with Eleanor again, despite generous offers. She'd even tracked down Eleanor's estranged sister in California, who hadn't spoken to the family in 30 years. The pattern was clear and undeniable. Brittany laid out her conditions for even considering staying married to Adam. Complete transparency about everything intensive couples therapy, and absolutely no contact with Eleanor unless and until she acknowledged the harm she'd caused and sought help herself. She looked at Eleanor and said she'd grown up with a narcissistic grandmother, so she recognized the signs. She wouldn't subject her future children to another generation of that poison. Eleanor had a complete breakdown. She started sobbing, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of rage that her control was slipping away. She screamed that we'd all regret this, that she'd destroy us all, that we were nothing without her. Then, in a moment of complete honesty, she admitted her own mother had treated her the same way. She'd been the disappointing daughter once, never pretty enough or smart enough for her mother's standards. Instead of breaking the cycle, she'd perpetuated it. She'd become her mother, maybe even worse. She'd turned her childhood pain into a weapon against her own children. The revelation didn't excuse her behavior, but it explained so much. Generational trauma dressed up in designer clothes and country club memberships. I stood up and delivered the speech I'd been practicing with Dr. Martinez. I said I was choosing healing over hatred. I was setting boundaries, not seeking revenge. I would no longer attend any family event where honesty wasn't welcome. I would not pretend our family was something it wasn't. And I was starting a support group for people dealing with toxic family dynamics, turning my pain into purpose. Eleanor looked at me with pure venom and said I was no longer her daughter. I replied that I never really had been. I was just a prop in her performance, and I was done playing that role. I walked out with my head high, Carol and Linda beside me, while Eleanor raged behind us. It was the last time I would ever be in that house. 6 months have passed since the wedding that never really was, and my life looks completely different now. The support group I started meets every Wednesday in a community center in Cambridge. What began with just 5 people has grown to over 50 members, all of us navigating the aftermath of toxic family relationships. We share stories, strategies, and most importantly, the understanding that we're not alone in this struggle. The group has become my chosen family in ways I never expected. There's Marcus, surprisingly enough, who reached out after hearing about everything. Not to reconcile romantically, but to apologize. He admitted that abandoning me during our fertility struggles was the greatest regret of his life. He couldn't handle the grief, but more honestly, he couldn't handle Eleanor's constant judgment about our inability to provide grandchildren. We're not back together, but we've found an unexpected friendship in our shared experience of loss and Eleanor's cruelty. Adam and Victoria are still together, though calling it together might be generous. They're in intensive couples therapy 3 times a week, both individually and jointly. Victoria gave him one chance to prove he could break free from Eleanor's influence and become his own person. They moved to California as far from Boston and Eleanor as possible while staying in the continental United States. Adam's learning who he is without our mother's voice in his head, and it's a painful but necessary process. He sends me updates, sometimes long emails about his therapy breakthroughs and setbacks. He's uncovering decades of suppressed emotions, anger he never let himself feel, dreams he abandoned for Eleanor's approval. His therapist says he essentially has to rebuild his entire identity from scratch. At 31, he's finally going through the individuation process most people complete in their teens. James is thriving in ways that surprise everyone, including himself. At 62, he's living alone for the first time in his adult life, and he loves it. His apartment is small, but warm, filled with medical journals, but also guitar music. He'd always wanted to learn guitar, but Eleanor called it juvenile. Now he plays badly, but enthusiastically every evening. He's even started dating Dr. Patricia Chen from the psychiatric department, a widow who makes him laugh and doesn't care about country club memberships. He's also been reaching out to all the family members Eleanor excluded over the years, trying to rebuild relationships she destroyed. Last month, he flew to San Francisco to attend Jeffrey's wedding to his partner of 10 years. He walked Jeffrey down the aisle since Jeffrey's own parents still won't acknowledge his sexuality. The photos show James crying happy tears, finally able to be the uncle he should have been all along. Eleanor, from what I hear through the grapevine, is exactly where you'd expect her to be. Alone in her perfect house with her perfect things and no one to share them with. Her real estate business collapsed after the wedding scandal. Boston society has a long memory for public humiliation, and hiring an actor to play your daughter's ex-husband is the kind of story that gets better with each telling. She had to sell the company to cover legal fees and settlement costs. She tried reaching out through lawyers a few months ago, not to apologize but to threaten me about potential grandparent rights if I ever have children. The irony of wanting access to hypothetical grandchildren from the daughter she publicly disowned wasn't lost on anyone. My lawyer recommended by Victoria's family actually shut that down immediately. Eleanor has no legal standing and, more importantly, no moral standing to be in my life or any future children's lives. The Worthington family has been unexpectedly wonderful to me. Mrs. Worthington calls me monthly to check in, and I've been invited to all their family gatherings. Last month at their 4th of July party, she introduced me as the brave woman who saved her daughter from a toxic marriage. She said my standing up to Eleanor, even from 3,000 miles away, showed Victoria what real strength looked like. I've become an honorary Worthington, which feels like the ultimate irony. Uncle Peter has become the father figure I never really had. We have dinner every Sunday, rotating between restaurants Eleanor would never approve of. Last week it was a hole-in-the-wall Ethiopian place where we ate with our hands and laughed until our stomachs hurt. He tells me stories about Eleanor as a child, how the signs were always there, but their parents encouraged her behavior, viewing it as ambition rather than cruelty. He's helped me understand the generational patterns that created Eleanor. Our grandmother was apparently even worse, a woman who disowned her own sister for marrying beneath her station. She drove our grandfather to an early grave with her constant criticism and demands. Eleanor learned that love was conditional, that perfection was the price of acceptance. She never learned how to break the cycle, only how to perfect it. The Family Rejects chat has evolved into a real support network. We celebrated Jeffrey's wedding together via video call. We supported Ruth through her divorce proceedings. We helped George launch his new business free from Eleanor's shadow and sabotage. Linda has become one of my closest friends, proof that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born into. My work with pregnancy loss and fertility struggle support has expanded beyond what I ever imagined. I volunteer at the hospital where James works, facilitating support groups for women going through what I experienced. I've written articles about the intersection of family trauma and pregnancy loss, how unsupportive families can compound the grief. Next month, I'm speaking at a conference about toxic family dynamics and their impact on mental health during fertility struggles. The miscarriages still hurt, they always will. But I've learned that grief and joy can coexist, that loss doesn't negate the possibility of future happiness. I'm dating again carefully and slowly with someone who knows my whole story and doesn't run from the complicated parts. His name is Daniel, and he has his own toxic family story. We joke that our kids, if we have them, will have the most emotionally intelligent upbringing possible because we know exactly what not to do. Victoria sent me a message last week that made me cry. She's pregnant 12 weeks along, and she wanted me to be the first family member to know. She said watching me stand up to Eleanor taught her that protecting your children starts before they're even born. It means creating a safe environment free from toxic influences, even if those influences share your DNA. She asked if I'd be the baby's godmother, a role that actually means something to her. The wedding disaster, as painful as it was, turned out to be the catalyst our family needed. It exposed decades of lies, manipulation, and cruelty that had been hidden under a veneer of success and propriety. Eleanor's carefully constructed image crumbled in one afternoon, but from those ruins, some of us have built something real and honest. I think about that day in Santorini, often sitting on my balcony while my family imploded 3,000 miles away. I'd felt guilty at first for not being there, for not trying harder to comply with Eleanor's demands. But Dr. Martinez helped me understand that my absence was my presence. By refusing to participate in the lie, I'd held up a mirror to the truth. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step away and let the house of cards fall on its own. The title of mother should mean something more than just biology. It should mean love, support, acceptance, and protection. Eleanor gave me life, but she never gave me those things. She gave me trauma disguised as privilege, criticism disguised as concern, and conditions disguised as love. Understanding that has been both heartbreaking and liberating. People sometimes ask if I regret how things turned out. If I could go back, would I have just worn the wedding ring, told the lies, played the part for one day? The answer is always no. That one day would have turned into a lifetime of one days, each compromise leading to another, until I disappeared entirely into Eleanor's fiction. The price of admission to Eleanor's world was my authentic self, and that was too high a cost. My name is Hazel, and at 31 years old, I learned that sometimes the best gift a toxic parent can give you is exclusion. Being banned from that wedding freed me from a lifetime of performance pretense and pain. While Eleanor sits alone in her perfect house, I'm surrounded by people who love me for exactly who I am. Imperfect, grieving, divorced, childless for now, but real. The vacation I booked in anger became my liberation. The wedding that collapsed was actually a revelation. And the family I lost was never really mine to begin with. The truth, as painful as it was to witness from across an ocean, set us all free. Some of us flew with that freedom. Others, like Eleanor, remained caged by their own creation. If you've made it this far in my story, you probably have your own Eleanor, your own toxic family dynamics, your own impossible choices between authenticity and acceptance. What boundaries have you had to set with family to protect your peace? Have you ever been excluded from a family event for refusing to maintain a lie? Drop your stories in the comments below. Please like this video if it resonated with you, and subscribe to hear more stories about breaking free from toxic family patterns. Share this with someone who needs to hear that choosing yourself over family approval isn't selfish, it's necessary. Thank you for listening to my truth, and remember, sometimes the best seat at a family event is the one 3,000 miles away. May you all find the courage to book your own flight to freedom when the price of admission becomes your soul.